Monsters in fiction rarely stay the same. Through new properties, creators, and artists, there can often be sweeping changes in their appearances and roles in the story, depending on who writes and makes them. With that said, outside of just the changes in creator hand, what are the causes of change in monsters? What makes their designs and depictions evolve in media? Some of the time, all you need is just one really, really good depiction of a creature that leaves everyone else running to catch up or freshly inspired to do their own interpretation or reimagining of it. To say dragons are common in fiction would be an understatement. With assorted fantasies across gaming, literature, and now especially film and television, they've perhaps never been so saturated in the public eye. But many of their more recent incarnations differ, and have grown from the original myths, and there may be one particular dragon that prompted that shift, or at least influenced them as individuals. The 1981 Disney film Dragon Slayer features Vermithrax Pejorative, a massive and impressive beast that was meticulously designed. Vermithrax was made to feel believable as something that could actually exist. Her back legs were shrank as she carried most of her weight on her winged forelimbs, which were enormous so she'd have a suitable wingspan, and wing loading, to fly. Vermithrax was based chiefly on rhamphorhynchoid pterosaurs with extra parts added over time, rather than being a more classic hexapodal dragon. As no living vertebrate was a hexapod, neither was Vermithrax. She was left uncoloured until the filming location was decided, and then coloured in accordance with the filming quarry, to give the impression of camouflage. All in all, Vermithrax doesn't just clutch out on the fact it's a fantasy to fly, or move, or exist. Rather, her brilliance comes from the thought put in to make her as real as possible. And it was this attention to detail that made her what is probably media's most significant dragon. Game of Thrones author George R.R. Martin describes Vermithrax as the best cinematic dragon put to screen, and used a similar process when making his own dragons, obeying the no hexapodal vertebrates rule and partially basing them off Vermithrax, even naming one of them Vermithor to reference her too. The visual effects team that later made the adapted television dragons similarly based them to an extent off Vermithrax, albeit with a significant keel for muscle attachment. The assorted teams of Reign of Fire openly say their dragons are attempts to be an updated version of Vermithrax herself, albeit made more robust with influences from tigers and tyrannosaurs, or that she was the one to beat when making their own dragons, using her as the launch pad to start designing theirs up from. Guillermo del Toro's joint favourite dragon is Vermithrax, and it's unknown how much of her went into making the initial groundwork for Smaug, before Peter Jackson took up the helm. It could be worth noting Smaug was changed from a hexapod between cuts of the film. On top of physical design, Vermithrax became so hostile as Galen slew her chicks, which she admittedly wasn't meant to have, but whatever. Collateral damage is never acceptable. And this is also a surprisingly novel take on things too. Dragons typically guarded hordes of treasure in fiction, if anything at all, and often weren't species but avatars of gods, divine punishment, or some weird singular individual. Whilst Vermithrax is the last of her kind bar her chicks, she is part of a kind, part of a species. Vermithrax gave the prompt that magical or fantasy animals could be more comparable to the beings of our world than were prior imagined, that just because they were fantasy didn't mean they were completely free from concepts in evolution and biology. They could have lives as a species outside of just a role in the story, and now the notion of a dragon guarding its eggs is almost the more prevalent trope than guarding treasure. Some species like monster hunters Rathalos, and especially the female Rathian, are almost defined by their strong parental behaviour. Whilst Galen may have slain her chicks, Vermithrax has had 100 more in the dragons of modern media that she inspired, making her the truest mother of dragons of all. It is interesting to consider what the next Vermithrax may be, and if there will be one. Caraxes was released to considerable fan appeal in House of the Dragon, so it could be that serpentine dragons could further infiltrate future IPs. Or similarly, Vhagar's distinct appearance as this truly aged behemoth, almost groaning under her own body weight, rather than ignoring it, could lead to a more grounded appearance of dragon. more about their limitations than their badassery. Only time will tell. On the other hand, a really bad or string of really bad interpretations can be the trigger for a reimagining, to restore fictional beings to their former glory. At its cancellation, Doctor Who kind of sucked. That was why it got cancelled. And it was also viewed as exclusively the domain of nerds. Not 2020's nerds where you passively consume the slop produced by the largest entertainment corporation in the world, but the early 2000s nerds where you'd probably actually get bullied for liking it. So when it was revived, it was really swimming against the current of public consciousness. So the foppish, quirky dork of a doctor was replaced with Christopher Eccleston's PTSD-inflicted war veteran. And while still very camp as a show, mostly, it still had a lot of heavy lifting to do just to get people to take it seriously again. The Daleks have always been synonymous with the show, and were just as much of a laughingstock in the public consciousness. With a not really very threatening or high-budget appearance and some really goony applications in episodes, it's no wonder really. So it's no surprise they needed a big overhaul. Writer of the revival episode Dalek, my personal favourite and probably one of the best of the revival overall, was keenly aware of this. So Robert Shearman used his wife as a stand-in for the general public. He asked her to name everything that seemed stupid or embarrassing or just generally mockable about the Daleks, and then took care in his script to outline each one and reimagine them as part of their universally lethal design, often with a character specifically lampooning said trait as the voice of the audience, before the Dalek reveals another party trick. Whilst the plunger now effectively functions as a synthetic touch organ, it can also just sort of kill you as well.
What you gonna do? Sucker me to death?
The body segments can now rotate independently, so it can kill you without having to engage reverse gear. And above all else, it can now fly.
Great big alien death machine, defeated by a flight of stairs.
Elevate!
Oh my god.
Even the lampooned Dalek bumps aren't just there for fashion. They're a crucial part of its self-destruct sequence. Even the updated version of the extermination visual effect itself has always struck me as a great way of showing what is clearly painful mortality that isn't just a tasteful cutaway, but also whilst keeping things PG. The Dalek itself was made more metallic and less plastic, with a brassy, bronzy exterior made to look heavier and stronger and practical, almost retro compared to the more typical low-budget sci-fi of past incarnations. Whilst the Daleks got less well written with each season, it could be worth noting they're only at their most truly interesting as villains when they're not being true Daleks. The main thrust of Dalek comes from it becoming more human, until it ultimately finds this unbearable and destroys itself. The Emperor was completely insane, and the cult of Skaro were designed to have dreams and emotions to better think like the enemy, and to allow for creativity. And surprisingly, unfeeling, merciless robot Nazis make for lethal obstacles, but require a lot of deviation from the base form for more compelling stories. Small wonder they began to feel overused by the end of the Russell T Davies era, and a mockery by the Moffat era, like most of the monsters in the show really. Another with a similar trajectory of a magnificent start before aging like milk, were the revival era Cybermen. The Cybermen aren't quite as synonymous with Doctor Who, with their outward appearance being more that of a typical robot, so they didn't have as much heavy lifting to do to overcome a starting point of ridicule. Yet Davies cooked anyway, and the two-parter Rise of the Cybermen and the Age of Steel are probably my candidates for some of the more underrated episodes of the revival. The Cybermen themselves being so successful, one due to the overall effort put into them. The Art Deco design is nice and recognisable to the monster as a whole, but the sound design is perhaps the best of any televisualised monster. The constant metallic stamping the Cybermen make when they move anywhere is distinctive enough to serve as their own leitmotif. Yet Murray Gold still gave them perhaps the most recognisable 6-note leitmotif in the revival era anyway. The build-up throughout the first episode for the reveal at the end is generally impeccable too. But the Cybermen are similarly reconstructed in their origins too. Whilst they've always had some level of statement about humanity's relationship with technology, The original Mondasian Cybermen were built from a writer's fear seeing prosthetic limbs, suggesting humans could replace too much of themselves with corrective surgery to ultimately stop being human. Davies felt this was outdated in the early 2000s, as was an initial draft of the upgrade angle coming from humanity regularly receiving organ transplants due to the dying world they lived on. Rather, it stemmed from humanity's obsession with technology and their striving to always update it, even if needlessly. The first revival Cybermen, the Cybus Cybermen, are just that, a brand.
Logo on the front. Lumic's turned them into a brand.
Made by sociopathic transhumanist John Lumic, who is unable to view the rest of humanity without the lens of pain, disability and looming mortality through which he lives his own life. The Cybermen are designed as the iOS update to humanity, purging all the fleshy weaknesses that plague Lumic himself. Not only is your identity taken away, it's replaced. You literally become merchandise or property yourself, with the logo on your chest. Humanity is now a copyrighted product. It would be tempting to make the story just another variation of iPhone bad, and there's still some elements of that, but it rather doubles as a critique of the obsession of capitalist forced redundancy and globalization. Lumic plans for the entire world to be converted and almost sweeps humanity, due to the fact he's the world's most successful tech mogul, and everyone's life is already so heavily in tune with his tech and only his tech. Humanity doesn't need to become Cybermen, but that doesn't stop the corporation creating it anyway. With the ease of life such insane technological advancements offer, it's ultimately impossible not to use them, and this becomes figurative and literal when the earpods are activated for the upgrading to occur. The Cyberman one-liner isn't the threat of death, but rather the promise of your conversion.
You will become like us.
You shall be like us. You will become like us.
Speaking of conversion, subscribe to the channel, but also another, perhaps the most popular monster that's recently undergone a recent overhaul is the zombie. The chief thing being their transition from slow to fast. Whilst there are other flavours of zombies, such as the thematically identical but not technically zombies, there are varieties of Resident Evil and Left 4 Dead mutant zombies, and other such types from the derivatives of those seminal games. These have typically always been present in some variety in video games for the sake of enemy variation. In cinema and TV, it was typically true and slow, right up until they went fast. And the chief property responsible for this overhaul was of course 28 Days Later. Viewed as somewhat boosting the horror genre and certainly reviving the zombie film, the fresh new take on zombies, as well as mixing them with human drama, was that they now ran. The Fast Zombie was made by 28's writer Alex Garland, from playing Resident Evil and wondering what it would be like if the zombies were as fast as the dogs. The similarly reanimated security Dobermans known as Cerberus. He found the tension came not from the zombies who one could outpace, but the lack of weapon resources to deal with them. And with this shift came a change in the origins of the zombie. Whilst many slow zombies are still spread via bite, there is often a period of death and then reanimation that was skipped with the 28 zombies, who just need a quick fluid transfer and then succumb to the effects of the virus. The death component is removed, literally and thematically. The most obvious analogue is of course rabies, a major inspiration for the actions of the 28 zombies. In writing about Charlie Brooker's zombified Black Mirror progenitor, Dead Set, co-writer of Shaun of the Dead and general film/zombo enthusiast Simon Pegg suggested a few things more cerebral about the slow-fast transition in modern media, as well as something of a critique. Fast zombies no longer represent the inevitability of our own mortality as they're not dead, just diseased. Slowies can be avoided, just as we can kid ourselves responsible behaviours and lifestyle changes can prevent death, when they only really prolong the inevitable, and it's questionable by how much. It's hard to say what fast zombies represent in comparison. In 28 Days Later, as said, director Danny Boyle suggested rage. But this isn't universal. A general fear of rabies or lysoviruses broadened into disease could be one point. A regression of man into a more animal state perhaps. But in these regards it's questionable even how comparable fasties and slowies are. Much like herpetology, the study of reptiles and amphibians, that lumps two things together because they look vaguely similar, over them being that related, so too are fasties and slowies lumped. When, if we were to make a thematic cladogram of classic monsters, the fast zombie is, if anything, more closely related to the werewolf over a slow zombie. For a far less pretentious analogy, Pegg also compares the fast zombie to the jump scare, and the slow zombie to the sense of genuine dread. He also suggests that the fast zombie may have been something of a symbol of the demands on speed at the turn of the 21st century, with emails replacing letters, fast food replacing sit-down, and the need to speed up an undead plague with running zombies. Technically, for Dead Set at least, Brooker does confirm this, saying he needed fast zombies to speed up the infection and take over, or the plot wouldn't have worked, as well as the fact a single fast and flexible rabid zombie can be a convincing threat. On this note, it does always surprise me such urgency was needed for 2 out of the 3 zombie IPs set in Great Britain. As a comparatively gunless land, the zombos of any form wouldn't face nearly the amount of resistance they would from the average American, who would probably need to upgrade the threat for. There is, in a way, a budding new type of zombie too, the natural zombie, i.e. one made by processes in the natural world, the best example of which is of course The Last of Us's cordyceps zombies. In the recent and decent television adaptation, the fungi and lore around it was modified to be caused by anthropogenic climate change. Overall, this new trend of not technically undead is obviously a narrative of Mother Nature getting back at us for that whole destroying the biosphere of the only planet we can live on thing. Or at least it starts as such before typically giving way to the human drama. So as the circumstances around monsters change, so too must they adapt with the times or be made redundant. Several reviewers, and indeed the characters too in a way, in the X-Files episode Home, note how it's a story that can only take place in the pre-Wi-Fi 90s, when everything was less connected. The whole thing with 80s nostalgia for a lot of monster or monster-adjacent features isn't just nostalgia pandering, but the acknowledgement that if some of these IPs existed today, the creatures or beings in question would either get found out and plastered across news media, or blasted by a wall of lead before the plot could really get going. One such monster whose original incarnation is such a case is King Kong. By now everyone knows Kong's story. Peaceful life on Skull Island, fall in love, deportation to New York, climb Empire State, die. Specifically death by biplane even. As such, this all has to occur before certain inventions exist, or the potential they have to change the story means it can't happen. 2023 Kong is pretty impossible. We'd already know just about everything about Skull Island as we can just GPS it, or fly some drones over it and other stuff. Similarly, the ending. Even if they end his life, the story of Kong is dependent on the biplanes. The first widely used military jet plane in the Americas, the F-86 Sabre, would make pretty short work of Kong indeed, and a helicopter with its ability to hover in place and blast away would annihilate him. Yes, Kong still has to die, but it removes a lot of the pathos if he just gets sawn in half by gunfire instantly, or missiled off the top of the Empire State Building. There's no doomed confrontation, or goodbye with Anne. So whilst post-World War II is debatable, what with the various aircraft on offer and how quickly it gets to New York, Kong effectively has to be a pre-Vietnam story for maximum effectiveness. As alternatively, you can just have terrible writing. The 1976 Kong has the helicopters attempt to fly into Kong, and generally act like biplanes after he sustains several hundred rounds of minigun fire. I suppose the whole hovering in place thing helicopters are known and invented for just wasn't cool enough. Or you can change Kong himself. This occurs most typically when he's put in conjunction with Godzilla, and often abandons the original story and theme in favour of two monsters punching each other a lot. The other joint king of kaiju, Godzilla himself, has decidedly flopped around with theme and role in story of late. The excellent first Godzilla was a somber allegory for nuclear weapons, with the Big G effectively being a living, walking nuke, and the very methods of its defeat being wrought with moral uncertainty. Following this, sequels featuring Anguirus and Kong and the rest were best summed up as Godzilla et al., being more about Godzilla punching other monsters than having a tone anywhere near that of the first film. Which is not to say that all of them are bad. Some are pretty enjoyable as films on their own merits, as are a fair few of the other Toho creations. More recent Goji flicks and kaiju flicks in general have tried to bake some theming and allegory into their monsters, and the operative word is tried, as almost every single one of them fumbles the bag each time. 2014 Godzilla simultaneously tries to make him an avatar of climate change, nuclear threat and nuclear salvation, and then the rest of the monsterverse generally can't make its mind up on this either. Only Shin Godzilla gets closest to matching the tone and substance of the original, because Shin Godzilla knew what it wanted to say, drawing much more from recent natural and nuclear disasters than wartime ones, and most of all of the useless and stifled government response to such disasters. Shin Godzilla's symbolism is clear, and is a lot more than wouldn't it be cool if two monsters hit each other, as overall, being giant avatars of destruction or other story tools, giant kaiju just work best with symbolism behind them. Otherwise you wind up with a lot of flashing lights but no real substance. As said, some films do try to say something, but it's abundantly clear it's a tacked-on message, and has no real bearing on things. The most frequent one we see in this regard is of course climate change, with a lot of kaiju having tangential connections to it because they come from the sea or something similarly limp-wristed. As said as well, in this regard there has been some attempt to tie Godzilla to this theme, in a botched fashion, but still. And this is one evolution I don't think should happen. As the most famous kaiju of all, Godzilla is the algae in the pond of public attention, soaking up all the oxygen of media consciousness whilst everyone else dies around him. With countries getting nuclear weapons / deterrence all the time, and the worth of nuclear power being discussed more and more, using Goji as an analogue for all things nuclear is never going to go out of fashion, yet can be constantly changed depending on the context. Discussion of nuclear fission and its uses and Godzilla in film are never going to go away. He doesn't need to have new themes tacked on, just be adjusted along with his main one. Making him a weird avatar of the natural world like the Monsterverse version feels like ignorance of his origins. And just as Kong is best as a pre-war kaiju, so too is Godzilla best as a post-war one in just about every aspect. Funny how attempts to take them out of their respective time zones and combine them seem to invariably result in hokum. Similarly, the current and looming threat of climate change should ideally be given to either a brand new monster or reinvigorating an old nobody in a new light. Lots of IPs in fiction in general are trying to incorporate it and failing drastically by either not being aware of what they want to say, not knowing enough about climate change, or how to use it as a symbol. As obviously the next big thing to be represented in fiction, it's a fruit that still remains low-hanging yet pretty ripe for the picking. Someone has to get it right at some point soon, surely. Thanks for watching, and thanks to top patron Phenomenon for his generosity towards the channel, as well as the Super Stupa, Amco the Terrible, Sonum Lobsong, K Sandom, Miguel, Erengar Steiny, Flygon's Archives, Hui Hui, Original Username, Inventory Overflow, Tristan Berry, Evely, Howleth, Archosaur Queen, Seth Fake Last Name, Zaysa, Dodecablos, and Bazugazu Bakuhatsu Bakumatsu, for their ongoing kindness keeping the channel going. Regarding the last video, I probably should have said it was intended to look at inter-specific rivals only. On brand as it would have been of me to say Rathalos' greatest rival is of course another Rathalos, as some of you pointed out. This was another smaller video I made as I was still pretty busy, and wanted something easier to make and write and put out. This also stems from an earlier script I started on Vermithrax before I realised it wasn't quite big enough for a full-length video, and so it got partially adapted here instead. Plus I had to at least briefly mention Godzilla at least once on the channel. It was also just intended to look at a few influential monsters over the years and not be a comprehensive overview of all of them and of all changes. So some you may expect may well be missing. The Xenomorph for one, but then I do think the alien itself is vastly overshadowed by how its film influenced sci-fi as a whole in media, rather than how the Xeno influenced movie monsters. but I hope those of you who watched this still enjoyed it, or at least found it fairly interesting. Next week it's back to the more usual of Monster Hunter species analysis, but the two I'll be covering don't really have a roar.